Hi friends, Father Terry here, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one about the moral message embedded in Robert Louis Stevenson's 1886 tale, Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Everybody knows the names of the eponymous characters from this novella, even if they've never read the book itself. And the reason for that is that the story has been reproduced dozens of times on the screen and on the stage, in comic books, in graphic novels. I understand that there are even a couple of Lego figures which represent Jekyll and Hyde. Lego calls them Mr. Good and Mr. Bad. The book was an instant bestseller. Stevenson originally intended to publish it in serial form in a magazine, but when the publishers read it, they knew that they had a moneymaker, and so they issued it as a book, and within weeks, 40,000 copies had been sold in England alone. Within a year, 250,000 copies were sold in the United States. People were intrigued by the story. To a certain extent, we've lost sight of the true nature of the story because of all of the commercial popularization of it. In point of fact, it is not a horror story, although interestingly, Robert Louis Stevenson originally intended it as that, until his wife Fanny told him that he had something much deeper, much better going on, whereupon he tore up the first manuscript and rewrote. No, it is a moral allegory. It is an allegory about what happens when we allow moral evil to overtake ourselves. And in telling this story, it seems to me that Robert Louis Stevenson perfectly exemplifies what St. Augustine in the 5th century called homo incurvatus in se. Incurvatus in se is Augustine's phrase for moral evil. When you and I commit moral evil, he says, we curve in on ourselves. We collapse in on ourselves. We ignore external moral standards. If we're God believers, we ignore divine command. All we're concerned with is somehow gratifying ourself, and that self is almost always base in its desire. That is the underlying theme of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So what we've got, the main character, Dr. Jekyll, is a middle-aged professional man who has done his best to cultivate a public persona of respectability. But in a confession that he leaves the reader, he tells us that he, from his youth, had been beset with desires that he knew were socially unacceptable, and that he felt as a consequence great shame whenever he surreptitiously acted upon these desires. Stevenson doesn't specify what these desires are. They almost certainly are sexual in nature. You have to remember that this story is written in the Victorian era, in which sexuality was always a source of great emotional and moral conflict for people, at least in England. He tells us at one point that he feels a perennial war among his members. It reminds me of what we discover when we read the diaries of 17th century English and American Puritans. They are always talking about a civil war within, the war that they think is being fought between their good side and their bad side, between their soul and their concupiscent desires. Robert Louis Stevenson comes from a Presbyterian background, a Calvinist background, and he surely was exposed to that way of thinking in his childhood. And even though he later moves away from Christianity, it's clear if one reads the story that that Presbyterian background has endured in one way or another. So in order to escape this perennial war among his members, Dr. Jekyll searches for a way to separate his two natures. He exults in both. He tells us plainly, I am not a hypocrite. I enjoy the respectable Dr. Jekyll, but I also enjoy these illicit desires that I have. The only painful thing is when they come into conflict with one another. So how can I separate them? And he discovers, because he's more of a chemist than a practicing physician, a way to bring out the two identities that he feels are lurking within him. And that second identity, of course, is Mr. Hyde. Now, the movies and the comic books and the television shows almost always represent Mr. Hyde as a grotesque, almost monstrous figure, misshapen, hideous to look at. That is not at all the way that he is described by Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson says that he has something about his appearance that repels people. They can't put their finger on what it is that so disgusts them. Stevenson tells us through the mouth of Dr. Jekyll that it must be because Mr. Hyde is pure evil. And there's something about encountering pure evil that turns people off. There's nothing monstrous on the surface about it, but there's a patina, there's a sheen to it that people can pick up on. Moreover, Mr. Hyde is much smaller in stature than Dr. Jekyll, and he looks younger than Dr. Jekyll. And the reason for that is that Dr. Jekyll has not been habituated to the evil that Mr. Hyde exults in. And so that part of Dr. Jekyll is smaller, less influential than the other part. The part that isn't necessarily perfectly good, but at least desires to obey the external norms and mores of society. As the story progresses, however, we discover that Mr. Hyde becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. The more that Dr. Jekyll drinks the potion, the more that Dr. Jekyll indulges in his wicked desires, the stronger, the taller, the larger Mr. Hyde becomes when he is present. Until by the end of the story, Mr. Hyde begins appearing whenever he wants to. Not simply when Dr. Jekyll mixes and drinks the potion that brings him out. He eventually overtakes Dr. Jekyll. Dr. Jekyll tells us toward the end of the novella that he has been enslaved by this alter ego, if you will, and that what once gave him great pleasure to be able to separate the Jekyll part of him from the Hyde part and let the Hyde part indulge in all of the illicit pleasures that Dr. Jekyll craved, till that separation is no longer pleasurable, but is painful. Now, go back to what Augustine says about moral evil or moral wickedness, or if you want to put it in Christian terms, sinfulness. It is always a collapse in, a curve in among ourselves. Dr. Jekyll curves in in himself. He senses that there are these illicit desires within him, and instead of moving away from them outwardly, he indulges them. He dives inside of himself in order to bring them out in full force. And as a consequence, he cares about nothing except personal satisfaction. He tramples over a young child. He eventually murders for absolutely no reason whatsoever except that it gives him pleasure a distinguished member of Parliament whom he encounters one night in the street. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson seems to be saying, are tendencies of human beings that define who we are. It's not that there's a good angel and a bad angel sitting on our shoulders. There is the person who we are, a person who wants public respectability, who wants to be admired by others, and there is the person who desires pleasures that he or she knows will not be acceptable to others. How to navigate those two persona, how to navigate those two aspects of what it is to be a human. Final word in this moral allegory, in this moral tale. Stevenson might be suggesting something like this. Take a strong look at what you desire and ask yourself Is it really shameful? Some desires clearly are, but other desires may not be. And if you confuse the two and try to repress them equally, what you might do is to create a situation in which you will periodically break out in a frenzy of excess. That happens to Dr. Jekyll. He tries to repress, and finally he gives in, he curves inward, he collapses inward, and when he does, havoc reigns. Perhaps Robert Louis Stevenson is inviting us to rethink what we consider to be immoral or sinful or wicked, to not negate the possibility of genuine wickedness, but to be discerning in our identification of it. I would really encourage you to forget all of the movies and all of the Hollywood renditions of this incredible moral allegory and get yourself a copy. You can easily find the entire text online. It will take you less than an afternoon to read it and to reflect deeply on whether you have discerned in yourself Mr. Hyde. I'm Father Carey, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much. If you are of a mind, I invite you to subscribe. At any rate, I'll see you again soon. God bless.